In this lesson, we will look at the anatomy of the lungs and the way that oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Then we will consider the function of carbon dioxide in the body, the partial pressure of oxygen, decompression illness, and the effects of a shortage of oxygen in the blood. The body's tissues all require oxygen in order to function as they should. For example, the brain requires 20% of the body's oxygen capacity, even though it only weighs 2% of the body weight, while the heaviest users are the skeletal muscles when working hard. In order to fulfill the body's need for oxygen, there are two systems: the respiratory and circulatory systems. The respiratory system, consisting of the lungs, draws in air, while the circulatory system circulates blood around the body to the tissues. Where the respiratory and circulatory systems meet, oxygen from the air is transferred to the blood, and carbon dioxide from the blood is transferred to the lungs and out to the open air. Let us look at this process in more detail. The air enters the nose, where it is warmed, moistened and filtered, or it enters the mouth, and then down the trachea, which is a tube reinforced with cartilage. The trachea divides into two bronchi, which take the air to the lungs. The lungs themselves consist of two large expanding sacs contained within the chest. Air is drawn into the lungs via the trachea. And bronchi, when the intercostal muscles between the ribs, acting in unison with the diaphragm, increase the volume of the chest cavity, thereby reducing the internal pressure inside the lungs to enable the body to breathe in, or, to use a more technical expression, to inspire. The airways in the lungs become progressively smaller until they end in tiny sacs, the alveoli, measuring about 0.3 millimeters in diameter. There are some 300 million alveoli, giving a total area of up to 100 square meters. The walls of the alveoli are very thin and are covered by fine capillaries, which themselves have only a thin wall. Oxygen from the alveoli diffuses into the blood and combines chemically with hemoglobin in the red cells to form oxyhemoglobin. Where, however, the concentration of oxygen is low, as in the tissues, the oxygen detaches from the hemoglobin and becomes available for the oxidizing processes in the tissues. For example, during exercise, our muscles are in constant need of energy. In the presence of oxygen, carbohydrates, fats and proteins can be broken down in order to generate the chemical compound of adenosine triphosphate, which drives the movement of the muscles. Carbon dioxide and water, which are the waste products from the body's consumption of oxygen, pass into the lungs to be exhaled. Effective gas exchange only takes place between the alveoli and the capillaries, as the walls of the larger passages in the lung are too thick to allow diffusion. Have a look at Fick's gas law in the lesson on the atmosphere, which is the principle which governs this diffusion. The gas exchange process at the lungs is called external respiration. Internal respiration is the expression used to describe the process by which gases are exchanged in the tissues during the work carried out in cells. Work may be mechanical, such as muscle contraction, chemical, as in the formation of proteins, electrical, as in the passage of a nerve impulse, osmotic, that is where a dilute fluid moves across a membrane to join fluids with a greater concentration, or simply in the liberation of heat. As part of this energy-producing process, waste products are formed, namely carbon dioxide and water, which are carried away by the blood to the lungs. carbon dioxide combines with the catalyst to form carbonic acid in solution in the blood, which releases its carbon dioxide in the alveoli. Because of the presence of this carbonic acid, our blood is naturally acidic. An acid base is required to allow the easy release of oxygen from oxyhemoglobin to the tissues. A reduction in the acidity of the blood, which can occur when there is insufficient carbon dioxide in the blood, as when hyperventilating, interferes with this release of oxygen. Carbon dioxide is 20 times as soluble as oxygen, and therefore finds it much easier to dissolve into blood to the detriment of the blood's oxygen content. It is the level of carbon dioxide, not oxygen, in the blood, which controls whether we increase or reduce our rate of breathing. If chemoreceptors in the carotid arteries in the neck and central chemoreceptors in the brain detect that the level of carbon dioxide in the blood is less than the standard, it will cause the lungs to work more slowly, so that the level of CO2 increases back to normal. Conversely, when carbon dioxide levels are higher than normal, such as in conditions of hypoxia, the rate of breathing increases. This increased breathing rate is similar to the condition of hyperventilation, or overbreathing, which we will look at in greater depth at the end of the lesson. Finally, we see how the partial pressure of oxygen in air affects the oxygen levels in the blood. The red cells contain the protein hemoglobin, which combines with oxygen and transports it around the body, releasing it in the tissue cells as required. We have seen how the amount of gas that passes through a membrane, such as a red cell wall, depends upon the relative pressures of the fluid either side of the membrane. At sea level, we have seen that the air pressure in the lungs can support a column of 103 millimeters of mercury. This is a sufficient pressure to effect a strong movement of oxygen into a red blood cell. However, air pressure reduces with altitude, and at 10,000 feet, the air pressure in the lungs can only support a column of 55 millimeters of mercury. This means that the amount of pressure available for moving oxygen through a red blood cell wall is about half that at sea level. The effect is that the red blood cells contain far less oxygen, and consequently they can only deliver a reduced oxygen supply to the body, and so performance reduces. Above 10,000 feet, the partial pressure of oxygen reduces progressively, as does the pilot's performance. Viewed from another perspective, hemoglobin is 97.5% saturated with oxygen at sea level, 87% at 10,000 feet, 72% at 18,000 feet, and 60% at 22,000 feet. Carbon monoxide is produced by the incomplete combustion of carbon in fuel. It amounts to about 1% of jet exhaust, but about 9% of piston engine exhaust, and maybe even higher in an old engine. Normally, carbon monoxide would be vented through the exhaust. But if there are leaking exhausts or heater casing pipes, carbon monoxide may get into the cabin, causing headache, nausea, dizziness, sore throat, and a dry cough. It does not cause a high temperature. In small aircraft, it is desirable to have a sensing device, like the one shown, which changes colour, and to be aware of the need for fresh air whenever the heater is being used. Carbon monoxide combines with hemoglobin to produce carboxyhemoglobin. Carbon monoxide is 210 times as soluble in blood as is oxygen, and it effectively stops oxygen from being absorbed into the blood. This will heighten the effects of hypoxia and will be cumulative over time.